Some of them call me Senor. Realize some of the students here were born in about 1992, right? Yeah, it's time flies when you're committing genocide or having fun. Let's see how much time I have. I want to say a couple of things about the project, and then I'll read a small excerpt from it. I want to thank Caroline and Annie. As I told my students last couple of days in class, that it's a great honor to get an award from people who, decades after they've had a class with a teacher in high school, are working and raising money and contacting people and keeping people aware of the contribution that their beloved teacher made to them. For all of us as teachers, that's the greatest honor you can have. I mean, you never know what influence you're going to have in the long run, and this is palpable truth and proof of what my colleagues and I managed to accomplish, and I'm really pleased to be a part of this faculty and to see the kind of things that people are doing. It came as a surprise to me. It took time for me to realize what I get here and what goes on here. It did take me time to realize this special thing that happens in this school. I did the high-tech thing last year. A number of you were here with the PowerPoint and talked about the project, and the project continues. I hope to finish it in the summer, but it continues to develop. It's sort of like a cotton candy machine that's gone berserk. And I was writing, I decided an editor told me that it would be useful to write an appendix or a small piece in the beginning explaining some parallels with the genocide in Cambodia and the genocide in the Balkans, and the way that the Western intellectuals and political activists had responded to these different events, because there were powerful parallels. And that began to grow, and the intellectual adventure was very powerful, and I ended up writing 50,000 words on that over the summer. And so what's happening is we're going to have to cut that off the book, and the publisher, the small press that is interested in the Balkan book and patient enough to still be interested in it after a number of years, is now interested in publishing the Cambodian text as a separate, smaller book. So now I have two unfinished books. Most people, they don't have a publisher. I've got a publisher who's waiting to get the book. So I don't know what's going to happen with it. But the intellectual process has been very powerful for me. And if any of you talk to me individually about it, I don't have time tonight to tell you about the things that I learned this summer, but they were truly remarkable and moving in a human sense. I'm not going to talk in detail about too many specific events, because what I've written about is largely, it's a history of the Slavs and the Albanians and the Croats and the various peoples in what's been called this cyclone of nations in the Balkans. And so it was very difficult for me to find something that I could read in a brief time to an audience, some of whom don't remember the events that spurred the book at all. And even my history colleagues might fade in and out on some of the references to this very narrow part of the world, which has so many implications for the larger world. So if you tend to fade in and out, that's okay. This is a reading, it's evening, and in all poetry readings, if you think you have to be like in calculus class and really paying attention all the time, or it might be the end of your life in this one step. It's not really how it works in poetry or in literary historical writing. So just enjoy. This is a little piece, a kind of a personal piece. I'm not even sure it'll end up in the final book. It might be somewhere else later. About reflecting at some point, midpoint in the book, it's intended to be about the problem of nationalism, which underlies the nationalism and the conflict between so-called nations that underlies the conflict that pulled me in and my interest in it. So here goes. It's called Interlude. It may be something later in the book later. Nemesis at Atlantis. At some point it became a commonplace in the literature to insist that Yugoslavia was an artificial creation from the start. In response, another commonplace has come to argue that it was not. Yet aren't all states artificial? As the Yugoslav novelist and essayist Dubravka Ugresic so wisely put it, the state is something quite incomprehensible. Their homeland is sea and mountains, and that's entirely comprehensible. While some people have formally declared themselves the subjects of and sworn an oath of loyalty to a particular state, perhaps with fingers crossed behind their backs under a kind of duress, most of us have never had to consent expressly to this status. We are subjects of this or that state through the merest accident, by having been born in a place which is not a state. In my own case, I feel connected to the place I inhabit, connected to the obscure history that brought me here to this place. Perhaps I too am this exhausted city with its broken dreams, its hands calloused by factory work, an anguished, always expectant blues tune in its heart. I am this river and this strait, this borderland shaped like a mitten, swaddled in sweetwater seas. I feel a parallel loyalty, nevertheless, a larger loyalty to my rootlessness, to the yearning that carried me here, and which has carried me and might yet carry me elsewhere. It's only an accident that I am where I am, and only a series of accidents that has kept me here. My father, of Scots-Irish background, happened to be born in Detroit because of my grandfather's restless wandering, and he grew up in Ireland and England before coming back here. Because of his history, I grew up feeling myself to be something other than an American, though friends in Europe tell me I am in some ways a rather typical Yank. This sense of otherness, along with my father's fierce notion of justice, shaped my coming of age during the Vietnam War, or the American War, as the Vietnamese call it. When I came of age, it was only the logistical near impossibility and my own lack of determination that kept me from following a powerful impulse to find a way to fight for the Vietnamese patriots against the American invaders. My mother was an orphan of sorts, an illegitimate child later adopted by her own father, a European Jewish immigrant who later disappeared in the 1920s, and his Gentile wife. That history added to my sense of always being someone's outsider, a self-proclaimed orphan in a world that belies orphans, that believes orphans to be possible. My mother ended up migrating to Hawaii by the merest chance, lured by a brochure, and became another Haole invader who became then a touch Kamaole, or local, adapted to and adopted by the place. Except for a handful of her ashes scattered here in Detroit, where she was raised, most of her earthly remains and the ashes of the woman she knew as her mother were scattered in a valley on the island of Maui. Like my mother's ashes, my heart is in more than one place. And so I find myself thinking, as Thoreau once put it, better to be sans terre, a landless saunterer, quote, having no particular home, but equally at home everywhere, end quote. Like Ugresic, I feel no sympathy for nationalism or loyalty to any state. When I first began to hear about the Yugoslav breakup, when independence declarations were published and shots were already being fired in Croatia and Slovenia, I wondered with dismay why the Yugoslavs would choose to separate at all over national differences, let alone start killing each other, rather than maintaining a country explicitly based on a diverse fabric of peoples. Knowing little about the context at the time, my attitude was, why not stay in Yugoslavia and fight? Why abandon a multicultural society, however flawed, that still held so much promise? That was the attitude of many people there, including Ugresic. Even in retrospect, even now that it's too late, my anti-nationalism favors this option. Why, it occurs to me, would anyone, already the involuntary inmate of a state, sacrifice anything to defend its privileged elite, its flag, currency, taxes, politicians, generals, armies, cops, and jails? Why fight to build another state with the same ensemble of domination, in many cases run by some of the same gangsters, or perhaps by new gangsters, perhaps only a little better, or a little worse than the last? Why kill your neighbors to preserve or to forge such a cold, cold monster? This is probably the naive attitude of a person who has lived, involuntarily or not, within a large and in many ways homogeneous empire, linguistically homogeneous for the most part, and who has, involuntarily or not, enjoyed the privileges of living in or being from that empire. But I sympathize with those Yugoslavs who rejected nationalist divisions by identifying themselves in the last census held there in 1991, just before the war, as Mercedes or Toshibas or Red Indians or Eskimos, a term meant entirely in a positive sense. Of course, some people become nationalists defensively because they are not allowed to forget who they are or who they have become in the nationalist conception of those who oppress, exclude, or attack them. That does not ultimately free them of their responsibility to address even their oppressors as human beings, to seek some basis for solidarity with sectors of the oppressor society, even if it might have been unrealistic in Kosovo, for example, to think they could. In any event, nationalism has probably always led to disasters. The nationalist mystique of the uniqueness of a nation and the accompanying notion that such a nation should have its own state based on universal political principles of sovereignty and self-determination shared by all so-called nations is both self-contradictory and false in its premises. Identity is always arbitrary and far more layered than any simple national, ethnic, or cultural definition. The idea of a nation having a certain religion or specific set of cultural traits is even more arbitrary. No culture is self-contained, no culture entirely unique, and the boundaries between cultures are never clear. And the more unique and idiosyncratic the traits of people in a given locale, the less national and simply more local and specific they are. In his book, The Fall of Yugoslavia, journalist Misha Glenny describes a visit he made in the early 1990s to Skopje, Macedonia, one of the republics of Yugoslavia that broke away eventually, during a festival. The music, he recalls, was provided by one of the many Macedonian rock bands who, since the collapse of communism, have devoted themselves almost exclusively to the cult of Alexander the Great. He adds, Alexander lived before the Slavs had settled in Macedonia, but he remains an important foundation stone upon which Slav Macedonian nationalists build their myths. And we might add, he's a source of Greek nationalist enmity toward the modern Macedonians. Reading that passage, I found myself wondering why they chose Alexander over his contemporary, the philosopher Diogenes, who is said to have coined the word cosmopolitan, or citizen of the world, to describe himself, and who, when Alexander offered him anything he desired, bluntly asked the most powerful man in the known world for nothing except that he step out of his light. Why not follow Diogenes then? Why not follow the example of the Croatian poet Augustin Ujević, who, sick of the Serbian and Croatian national conflicts of the early 1920s, denounced the lie of the entire present situation and the whole social order and declared himself an Irishman? Ironically, another place infected with the plague of nationalism. According to one charming story, we are all, every one of us, offspring of the African Eve of the Olduvai Gorge. We are all, then, and let us all be, Africans. In fact, we are little more than sophisticated chimpanzees and cousins of all the apes, offspring of the original slime mold, for that matter. And we are all orphans, belonging to no one and to nowhere, to everyone and to everywhere. At a peace demonstration in Sarajevo in November 1991, before war exploded in Bosnia, a miner declared before a crowd of tens of thousands of people, "We won't let our sons die for the purposes of others. We are workers, not soldiers. My national identity is miner." Let us all be miners then. The workers have no country. Let us renew those hallowed gestures of refusal. Our enemy is at home. Turn imperialist war into class war. I just had to say that in this room. Following Diogenes then, I wish to affirm my loyalty not to any official mapped land, but to the land organism itself, becoming in that way a member of a planetary community, not just of human beings, but of all species. All lands are the Holy Land, and I want to carry this holiness everywhere within me on my wanderings, as Thoreau recommends. I prefer to be a worthy son of the cosmos, one star among many, loyal to its microcosmic and its macrocosmic manifestations, to its interior and exterior life, rather than a cog in the leviathan of some uniformed mandarin. And yet opposition to nationalism does not absolve us of the responsibility to distinguish styles of imagined communities, and hence styles of nationalism. Thinking of the suppression of Albanian culture and language by the Serbian national apartheid regime of the 1980s and 90s, of the oppression of other ethnic groups around the world, I cannot help but acknowledge some other reasonable style, even if I am not able to share any, of nationalism, a word reportedly coined by the German romantic Johann Gottfried Herder. Every nation has its own inner center of happiness, as every sphere its own center of gravity, declared Herder, but he also insisted that all cultures had their role to play in the world, that none should outshine the others. Herder, much maligned for what nationalists have since done, said, "To brag of one's country is the stupidest form of boastfulness," and "one fatherland ranged against another in bloody battle is the worst barbarism in the human vocabulary." Why can't these two overlapping, if not entirely consistent sensibilities, love of one's homeland and what one thinks is a unique way of life, and a hatred for the nationalism of power in the state, coexist? Admirable as they are, Herder's notions of cultural pluralism and unity in diversity, and his hatred for the imposed uniformity and cultural leveling of great empires, raise complex questions with no definitive answers. Again, where one culture ends and another begins is impossible to discern. All cultures are hybrids, and we are all mongrels, and it makes sense to remind ourselves of this as often as possible. But there is more than one kind of cosmopolitanism or globalism, and perhaps more than one kind of localism or even nationalism. When Indian farmers trash a Kentucky Fried Chicken to protest the leveling and destruction of agriculture and local food culture, I sympathize. When Hindu nationalists destroy a 17th century Muslim mosque because India must conform to some fossil image of what they imagine India once was, they're imposing a fascist uniformity and demolishing, along with a structure saturated with historical memory itself and a vibrant diversity. Such battles tell us that the tension between the local and the universal can only be sorted out in practice and in context. Ultimately, what matters is not so much how one explains the mystery of our diverse, I said divine there, my mistake, our divine origins, then, our histories, our commonalities, and our differences, but rather what matters is the ability to remember one's obligations to the larger human community and to collective memory, to both the local and the cosmic. In her lament for the passing of Yugoslavia, Ugresic ponders the widespread comparison her contemporaries made between the collapse of their country and the myth of Atlantis, the island that disappeared into the sea, and she cannot help but wonder, what was it that so angered the gods? Being what they are, gods have a way of acting capriciously. No rational analysis of history or political economy could ever satisfy those who have lived and who continue to live through the cataclysm. But we might respond that this Atlantis sank in the sea because its peoples did not confront their myths. All ideas about human origins and identity are composed of a mixture of rationality and irrationality. And whatever our pretensions to the contrary, to be rational beings who act on the basis of scientific evidence and historical fact, we continue to live enfolded in myth. Our failure to recognize this condition contributes to our tendency to distort the capacity of myth to teach us how to live by reducing it consciously and unconsciously to political manipulation, a lesson that has invariably taught us to kill. It was Nemesis whom the gods dispatched to carry out divine retribution. And so we might assume that this goddess associated with soldiers, thought in one story to be the mother of Helen, who we remember inadvertently caused an earlier Balkan war, might have carried out the divine decree to sink Atlantis. Nemesis must have been as well at all the towns of Croatia and Bosnia and Kosovo as the armies and mercenaries swept through. And she was there when NATO's bombs fell on Serbia and Kosovo in 1999. Or perhaps the gods were simply making sport with people who had suffered too much violent trauma to find their way out of the labyrinth of their history. The Montenegrin psychiatrist Radovan Karadzic led the nationalist revolt of the Bosnian Serbs that brought such suffering to all the peoples of that diverse land. It was only this summer that he was arrested in Belgrade and sent to the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague to be tried for crimes against humanity and genocide. As Bosnia moved toward independence in 1990-91, Karadzic and his followers insisted that Bosnian Serbs, Muslims, and Croats were not meant to live together. Tito threw us together, he said. We were like oil and water. While he shook us, we stayed together. Once we were left alone, we separated. Karadzic's claim that people could not live together, wrote Bosnian poet Semezden Mehmedinovic later, quote, was simply a euphemism for racism. The truth was just the opposite. Peoples of different cultures had lived together for so long in Bosnia, and the ethnic mix was so deep that any separation could only be accomplished through extreme violence and enormous bloodshed. Bosnia, with its endless variations of difference and intermingling, belied Karadzic's notion of racial purity. In contrast, Bosnian President Alija Izetbegovic, a Muslim, spoke of togetherness. To isolate Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, he said, would be like trying to separate cornmeal from flour after they were stirred in the same bowl. More than any other city in Europe, Sarajevo had been a symbol of integration and tolerance, and Europe's truest melting pot. As Sarajevo theater director Javad Karahasan has put it, the very physical configuration of the city, and in the flat bottom of a valley, the city center girded by mahallas or neighborhoods, gives it a kind of inwardness that invites self-reflection. And that makes it a kind of metaphor, quote, metaphor for the world, a place where different faces of the world gather at one point in the way that scattered rays of light gather in a prism, end quote. Settled by people from the world's four dominant monotheistic religions and their cultures, Judaism, Islam, and the Roman and Orthodox churches, he writes, quote, with myriad languages and ways of life, Sarajevo became a microcosm, a center of the world that contained the whole world within itself, as mystics would say, end quote. These Sarajevans, Serbian Orthodox, Croats, Roman Catholic Croats, Muslims, Jews, atheists, and Eskimos loyal to the Bosnian ideal of unity and diversity, were the people who had demonstrated against nationalist violence and for tolerance and democracy in late 1991 and the spring of 1992. They had taken to the streets to demand peace and were shot at by the Serb nationalist paramilitaries from the upper floors of the Holiday Inn and from across the Vrbanja Bridge, which would become a front line in the war between the Bosnian Republic and the Serb nationalist enclave. When the siege enclosed the city and Serb nationalist snipers and bombers began their deadly work and the buildings began to burn, some stayed in the city because they believed in Bosnia, and some stayed because they had nowhere else to go. They were human beings, not angels. They could be no better or worse than other cities. And as one might expect, the siege brought out the best and the worst in them. Like the people of Oran in Camus' novel, The Plague, they had to simply know that they had been sentenced for an unknown crime to an indeterminate period of punishment. 10,000 of them died under the guns of the besiegers. Bizarrely, it later turned out that most Bosnian Serbs who were killed in the Bosnian War were not killed by Croatian and Muslim nationalists, but were Serbs inside the Bosnian Republic towns killed by the shelling carried out by Karadzic's Serb nationalist henchmen. In April 1995, Maja Jocic, a 17-year-old Sarajevo girl, the daughter of a Slovenian-Serbian father and a Muslim mother, was killed by shrapnel from a Serb gunner's shell while walking home from a volleyball game. Alexander Lucic, also Serbian, saw her fall and took her to the hospital. Maja, one of some 1,700 children killed by the Serb nationalist besiegers at the time, would not have attracted attention but for the fact that she, too, was part Serbian, and Lucic was also Serbian. Serbs loyal to the Sarajevo government continued to give the lie to the fascist claims that Serbs and Muslims could not live together. And so 2 days after she died, Karadzic's television station showed a bloody shot of her while commenting, "The girl is not a victim of Serbian shelling, as the Muslim media said, but a victim of Izetbegović's followers. On Friday night, they raped her, killed her, and threw her out on the plaza in front of the stadium. The Muslims caught this unfortunate girl as she was trying to escape to the Serb part of Sarajevo on the other side of the line." I saved the article about Maja from the New York Times, thinking to write someday about her, about Bosnia. I only found the clipping by chance in an old file when I was well into this essay. I'd saved the article as a token of my own rage and depression about a place that seemed to have held such promise and that was destroyed by madness and indifference. I had hoped to do something to bring some small measure of justice, to let people know about her, if nothing else. I've brought little justice, but I've managed to share her story with a few people. I'm far from fulfilling my obligation to her and others, but I've done something. This essay and this reading are dedicated to her. She could have been my student. Hardly anyone in Sarajevo had prepared for war before the siege, and so, since the bricks in his basement were inadequate protection from the shelling, Kara Hassan, the theater director, salvaged some heavy-hewn stones from the bombed ruins of the Maghribiya Mosque. The imam told him to help himself to them. "If these stones end up saving someone's life or just diminishing people's fear," he told Kara Hassan, "they will be truly sacred." Those who survived the siege were left to make sense of such fragments. For all of us, Sarajevo, microcosm and center of the world, and Bosnia and its bridge, and too many other places have become such shards. We will have to make sense of them before we are prepared to understand the whole truth, that the Bosnian ideal of unity and diversity, and with it a commitment to justice for all, are essential minimum requirements for human continuity. As Sarajevo journalist Zlatko Dizdarevic warned in his journal of the plague years, Sarajevo's story is not unique. Many other towns like it lie along the road of the madmen who have ruined it. He meant Croatian and Bosnian towns, but there are towns everywhere that fit the same description. Of course, we Americans especially, have a history to face, and we have failed so far to take responsibility for it. We too continue to betray ourselves with our nationalist myths, which have become modernized, cybernetic, televised myths. Are we all then doomed to renew these bloody cycles? Paradoxically, that depends on us. In one of the fragments left by that Balkan sage Heraclitus we read, the people should fight for their law as for their city wall. In Sarajevo's case, law and wall were one. The world let them burn, and a widening cyclone of global war and extermination is a consequence. And yet, there was and is also life. There is hope. There is possibility. Next year in Sarajevo. Thank you.